A man built a fence across a public beach. When Oregon's governor heard about it, he didn't call a lawyer. He went to war. The year was 1967. The man was a hotel developer in Cannon Beach. His fence stretched across sand that families had walked for generations. And by the letter of Oregon law at the time, he was allowed to build it. Governor Tom McCall had just 6 days to stop him. Not 6 months. Not 6 weeks. 6 days. After that, the legislature would adjourn, and the opportunity to act could disappear for years. So McCall reached for an idea almost everyone had overlooked. A law passed more than half a century earlier. In 1913, Oregon declared the wet sand between high and low tide to be a public highway. Lawmakers now pushed that idea even further, extending public access 16 vertical feet above the shoreline to protect the dry sand where families actually gathered. It was an extraordinary gamble, and it worked. Barely. That decision is why every beach in Oregon remains public today. While in much of America, a fence like that could still stand. But saving the beaches with one law wasn't enough. Just 2 years later, another lawsuit threatened to unravel everything McCall had fought to protect. This time, Oregon's Supreme Court couldn't rely on the beach bill alone. Instead, the justices reached back beyond the state's own history, beyond the founding of the United States, to a legal doctrine buried deep inside English common law. It became the second foundation beneath Oregon's coastline. Decades later, that foundation would face its greatest test when the fight reached the United States Supreme Court. One justice warned that the legal theory protecting Oregon's beaches raised a serious constitutional question, a question that could have changed the future of the entire coastline. This is the story of how one state did something no other state in America has managed to do, and why, more than a century later, that fight still isn't over. To understand how it started, you have to go back to the beginning. Before McCall, before the fence, before any of it. Oswald West became Oregon's governor in 1911 at just 38 years old. Newspapers called him the boy governor. While many politicians focused on railroads, industry, and expanding cities, West saw something different: the coastline. He believed Oregon's beaches should belong to everyone, not just the people wealthy enough to own land beside the ocean. At the time, that wasn't an abstract concern. The state had already sold more than 20 miles of tideland into private hands. Resorts were beginning to appear in Seaside, Newport, and Rockaway. Every new railroad brought more visitors to the coast, and with them came more investors eager to turn the shoreline into private real estate. West saw exactly where that future was heading. If nothing changed, Oregon's beaches wouldn't disappear overnight. They would disappear one property at a time, one deed at a time, until ordinary people found themselves with nowhere left to stand. Years later, West recalled riding the coastline on horseback from Elk Creek through Cannon Beach and over Nair Kearney Mountain. Somewhere along that journey, an idea began to take shape. He didn't want the state to buy every beach. He wanted to protect them with something far simpler: a legal designation. West proposed expanding an existing 1899 law that had already declared beaches in one Oregon county to be public highways. If lawmakers agreed, the same principle could protect the entire coastline. The legislature moved surprisingly fast. Less than a month later, the bill had passed both chambers. On February 11, 1913, Oswald West signed it into law. For the next 50 years, most Oregonians believed the question had been settled. It hadn't. The law protected only the wet sand between high and low tide, the part of the beach covered by the ocean twice each day, the dry sand above it, where families spread blankets, children built sandcastles, and visitors spent entire afternoons, was never mentioned. For decades, almost nobody noticed, not because the gap wasn't there, because no one had tried to test it. That changed the summer a hotel opened its doors in Cannon Beach. Its owner, William Hay, decided to ask a question no one else had dared to ask. What if the dry sand was private? He dragged massive driftwood logs across the beach behind his property. He arranged umbrellas and tables inside the enclosure. Then he posted signs declaring the area private. To Hay, it marked the boundary of his land. To thousands of Oregonians, it looked like the beginning of something much bigger. The reaction was immediate. A Portland professor named Robert Bacon wrote to the State Highway Commission asking a simple question: how could this possibly be legal? The answer shocked everyone. The celebrated 1913 law, the one generations had pointed to as proof that Oregon's beaches belonged to the public, had never protected the dry sand at all. William Hay hadn't uncovered a loophole. He had uncovered an absence. And once the state admitted that gap existed, every stretch of Oregon's coastline suddenly became a legal question. The fight to save Oregon's beaches didn't begin inside the governor's office. It began with ordinary people who refused to accept that a fence could change the coastline forever. Bacon wasn't a politician. He wasn't a lawyer. He taught anatomy at the University of Oregon Medical School. But he had spent years walking Oregon's beaches. He immediately understood what William Hay's fence really represented. If one hotel could claim the dry sand, what would stop the next one, or the one after that? When another beachgoer, Lawrence Bitty, grew frustrated waiting for action from the governor's office, he reached out to Bacon instead. That phone call quietly became the beginning of a statewide movement. There were no viral campaigns, no social media, no 24-hour news cycle, just letters, phone calls, and conversations between neighbors. One by one, supporters began contacting legislators who had never seriously considered who owned the sand beneath their feet. The campaign grew slowly, sometimes frustratingly slowly. By the time House Bill 1601 reached the legislature in 1967, its chances looked uncertain. Then the newspapers changed everything. Associated Press reporter Matt Kramer had followed the story almost from the beginning. As public debate intensified, he gave House Bill 1601 a name people immediately understood: the Beach Bill. His reporting carried the story into newspapers across Oregon. As more people learned what was happening, public pressure began to build. Opponents responded with what sounded like a reasonable compromise. Instead of protecting the entire stretch of dry sand, they proposed protecting only 7 feet above the tide. On paper, it sounded fair. Governor Tom McCall knew it wasn't. A number written into law meant very little unless people could actually see what it looked like. So McCall staged one of the smartest political demonstrations in Oregon's history. He flew reporters, photographers, and scientists from Oregon State University to Seaside Beach by helicopter. Standing on the sand, they measured exactly where the proposed 7-foot boundary would fall. The results spoke louder than any speech. The line ended so close to the dunes that a family couldn't realistically spread out a blanket without crossing onto private property. What had sounded like a compromise suddenly looked meaningless. Television stations carried the images across the state. Newspapers published illustrations showing fences rising beside Haystack Rock. Almost overnight, the debate stopped being about legal boundaries. It became personal. Thousands of letters, telegrams, and phone calls poured into the legislature from people who had never contacted an elected official before. McCall wasn't fighting alone. State Treasurer Bob Straub was leading another effort to protect Oregon's coastline, this time opposing plans to build a highway across the Nestucca sand spit. The two men didn't always agree, but on this, they stood together. Oregon's coastline wasn't just another piece of real estate. It was part of the state's identity. Public pressure became impossible to ignore. The House approved the beach bill by a decisive vote of 57-3. The Senate followed. On July 6, 1967, Tom McCall signed House Bill 1601 into law. For the first time, Oregon formally protected the dry sand, extending public access 16 vertical feet above the low tide line. The fence was gone. The law had changed. The beaches seemed safe. They weren't. 2 years later, the courts would reveal that the biggest legal battle was still ahead. The beach bill had survived the legislature. Now it had to survive the courts. It didn't take long for that challenge to arrive. Just 2 years after Governor Tom McCall signed the beach bill into law, another landowner stepped forward. He wanted to test whether Oregon had gone too far. The case became known as Thornton v. Hay. At first glance, it looked like another dispute over property lines. It wasn't. The outcome would determine whether Oregon's newly protected coastline rested on solid legal ground, or whether the entire beach bill could begin to unravel. The argument seemed straightforward. The government couldn't simply declare private property to be public because lawmakers wanted it that way. Whether the boundary was 7 feet, 16 feet, or 50, if the land belonged to someone else, the Constitution raised difficult questions. If the court agreed, Oregon wouldn't just lose one lawsuit. It could lose the legal foundation protecting its entire coastline. The Oregon Supreme Court faced a choice. It could defend the beach bill directly, or it could search for a different answer. It chose the second path. Instead of relying only on a law passed in 1967, the justices reached back through history, past Oregon's statehood, past the founding of the United States, into English common law. There, they found something extraordinary. A legal principle known as the Doctrine of Custom. The idea was surprisingly simple. Some rights become so deeply woven into everyday life that they eventually carry the force of law. Not because a government created them, because generation after generation never stopped exercising them. The court concluded that Oregon's dry sand beaches belonged to the public in exactly that way. Long before legislators passed the beach bill, people had already been walking these beaches, fishing, gathering, crossing the sand without interruption. The law hadn't created that right. It had finally recognized one that already existed. To reach that conclusion, the court relied on a legal commentary published in 1778. It described 7 conditions a custom had to satisfy before a court could recognize it as law. The custom had to reach back beyond living memory. It had to be continuous, peaceful, reasonable, clearly defined, applied equally to everyone, and consistent with the community's other customs and laws. According to the court, Oregon's beaches met every one of them. With that decision, the court did something remarkable. It didn't simply uphold the beach bill. It gave Oregon's coastline an entirely different legal foundation, one that no legislature had created. and no legislature could easily erase. It was an elegant solution, but it rested on an unusually fragile idea. Not a deed, not a purchase, not even a modern law. The public's right to Oregon's beaches now depended on customs so old that no one could point to where they had first begun. For decades, that reasoning held. Almost no one questioned it. Then another lawsuit arrived. This time, the challenge would reach the highest court in the United States. For nearly a quarter of a century, the Doctrine of Custom did exactly what it was supposed to do. It protected Oregon's beaches. Life along the coast continued much as it always had. Families spread towels across the dry sand. Surfers crossed the beach to reach the waves. Visitors walked for miles without stopping to wonder who owned the ground beneath their feet. The legal battle seemed finished. It wasn't. In the early 1990s, another dispute began in Cannon Beach. This time, it wasn't about a fence. It was about a seawall. Oceanfront homeowners wanted permission to build a rock wall to protect their property from the Pacific. The city refused. Its reasoning sounded familiar. The dry sand wasn't exclusively theirs. The public had a customary right to use it. The homeowners, David and Kathleen Stevens, challenged that decision in court. Unlike William Hay's earlier dispute, their case struck at the heart of Oregon's legal strategy. They weren't arguing about where the boundary should be. They were questioning the doctrine of custom itself. If Oregon could declare privately owned land public without compensation, wasn't that a government taking? And if it was, shouldn't the Fifth Amendment require the state to pay? It was the most serious legal challenge Oregon's beaches had faced since Thornton v. Hay. Once again, the Oregon Supreme Court ruled in favor of public access. The justices reached the same conclusion. The doctrine of custom wasn't creating a new public right. It was recognizing a limitation that had always existed. In other words, the public hadn't gained something new. Private landowners had simply never possessed the exclusive rights they believed they had. The Stevenses refused to stop there. They appealed to the United States Supreme Court. If the nation's highest court agreed to hear the case, everything could change. In 1994, the court announced its decision. It declined to hear the case. For most lawsuits, that would have been the end of the story. This one left behind something far more interesting. One justice disagreed. Antonin Scalia believed the court should hear the case. In a published dissent, he warned that Oregon's interpretation of the doctrine of custom raised a serious Fifth Amendment question. If the state's reasoning was wrong, the consequences wouldn't stop with one property in Cannon Beach. They could extend across the entire Oregon coastline. The court still allowed the Oregon ruling to stand. The doctrine of custom survived. Oregon's beaches remained public. But Scalia's warning never disappeared. Even today, it remains one of the strongest reminders that the legal foundation beneath Oregon's coastline has never been fully tested by the nation's highest court. For more than a century, the beaches have remained open, not because the debate ended, because every time it returned, Oregon found another way to hold the line. By this point, Oregon's coastline had become something remarkably rare. Not because its beaches looked different, because its laws did. To understand just how unusual Oregon really is, you have to leave Oregon. Drive south into California, and the rules begin to change. Public access generally extends only to the mean high tide line. On paper, that sounds simple. In reality, reaching that shoreline can be another matter entirely. Across parts of California, private landowners have fenced access paths, locked gates, and fought years of legal battles over the routes leading to beaches the public already has the right to use. Owning the beach isn't always necessary. Sometimes, controlling the road to it is enough. Texas chose a different solution. For decades, its Open Beaches Act was considered one of the strongest public access laws in America. Then nature complicated everything. Powerful hurricanes reshaped the coastline. Dunes moved inland. Vegetation shifted. And as the shoreline changed, court rulings left some public easements legally uncertain. Cross the Columbia River into Washington, and the picture changes again. Washington never adopted anything like Oregon's Doctrine of Custom. Many dry sand beaches remain private property. Visitors are often welcome, but they're guests, not rights holders. That's the difference. Oregon didn't become unique because its coastline was more beautiful. It became unique because, over more than a century, lawmakers, judges, and conservationists built one layer of protection after another. The 1913 Highway Law, the Beach Bill, the Doctrine of Custom. Each solved a different problem. Together, they created something almost no other American state has. That's why Oregonians call it the People's Coast. It isn't a slogan. It's the result of more than a century of people asking one simple question: who should be allowed to stand on the sand? Winning that fight changed McCall. He didn't see the beach bill as the end of his work. He saw it as the beginning. Saving Oregon's beaches revealed something important about the governor. He wasn't afraid of political fights, especially when they involved Oregon's landscapes. Over the next several years, he kept choosing battles that many politicians would have avoided. In 1971, Oregon became the first state in America to require refundable deposits on bottles and cans. Today, bottle bills feel ordinary. At the time, they were anything but. Supporters saw cleaner roadsides and cleaner beaches. Powerful industries saw government overreach. McCall signed the law anyway. Then came statewide land use planning. The new laws limited how cities could spread into farmland, forests, and open landscapes. Developers protested. Property rights advocates pushed back. Political opponents promised to undo the restrictions. McCall never changed course. Years later, while battling prostate cancer, he publicly campaigned against a ballot measure that threatened those same protections. He knew the effort would exhaust him. He did it anyway. One television interview captured his philosophy better than any speech. Speaking to a national audience, McCall smiled and welcomed visitors to Oregon. Then he added a sentence that became famous. "Come visit us again and again. But for heaven's sake, don't come here to live." The remark spread across newspapers throughout the country. Some people laughed, others criticized him. But everyone understood the message. Oregon wasn't simply another place waiting to be developed. It was something worth protecting. McCall wasn't the only one protecting the coast. Long before he defended Oregon's beaches in the legislature, another man had quietly been protecting the coastline itself. His name was Samuel Boardman. Unlike West or McCall, Boardman rarely fought inside courtrooms or legislative chambers. His work happened outdoors. In 1929, he became Oregon's first superintendent of state parks. For the next 2 decades, he traveled the coastline buying land whenever the opportunity appeared. Sometimes it was a rugged headland, sometimes a hidden cove, sometimes a narrow strip of shoreline that most people barely noticed. Boardman noticed. He understood something many others missed. A legal right means very little if people can't reach the place they're supposed to enjoy. So, mile by mile, parcel by parcel, he secured public access to the coast. Many of those purchases seem almost unimaginable today. Land that now attracts visitors from around the world was acquired long before anyone recognized its future value. Without those access points, the victories won by Oswald West and Tom McCall would have protected beaches that many people could never reach. Boardman dreamed of preserving Oregon's southern coastline as a national park. That vision never fully became reality. Part of it survived. Today, one of the most spectacular stretches of Oregon's coastline bears his name: the Samuel H. Boardman Scenic Corridor. Towering sea stacks, ancient forests, hidden coves, natural bridges carved by the Pacific itself. It reminds us that protecting a landscape isn't always about passing laws. Sometimes, it's about protecting a place before the rest of the world realizes what could be lost. For more than a century, Oregon has fought to keep one line from moving. Ironically, the coastline itself refuses to stand still. Every winter, Pacific storms reshape the shore. Bluffs collapse. Dunes migrate. Entire stretches of beach look different from one season to the next. The laws protecting Oregon's beaches were written for fixed boundaries. Nature has never cared about boundaries. In recent years, homes have been threatened by collapsing cliffs. Communities have debated seawalls. Engineers, scientists, property owners, and conservationists continue searching for answers. Hard seawalls can protect houses. They can also narrow the beaches the public fought so hard to preserve. Leaving the shoreline untouched protects the beach, but it can leave homes vulnerable to an ocean that grows more powerful every year. The debate hasn't disappeared. It's simply changed. More than a century after Oswald West signed the highway law, Oregon is still asking the same question. Where should the line be drawn when the line itself keeps moving? More than a century ago, Oswald West imagined a future where every person, not just every landowner, could stand beside the Pacific. Samuel Boardman quietly protected the places people would one day use to reach that shoreline. Tom McCall defended those beaches when a single fence threatened to change everything. Their victories were never guaranteed. Each generation faced a different challenge. Each generation chose to protect the coastline anyway. Standing on an Oregon beach today, it's easy to believe it has always been this way. That anyone could walk beneath Haystack Rock, watch the tide roll in, or wander for miles along the Pacific without stopping to ask who owns the sand. History tells a different story. Every step across Oregon's coastline rests on decisions made by people who believed that once public land is lost, getting it back becomes far more difficult than protecting it in the first place. Perhaps that's the real legacy of Oregon's beaches. Not that they are public, but that, for more than 100 years, each generation has chosen to keep them that way. And somewhere beyond the next headland, as the Pacific continues reshaping the shore, that choice is waiting for the next generation. What are your thoughts on this? Drop a comment telling me where in the world you are watching from. I want to know exactly how far these hidden stories are reaching.